Hello, dear friend, and welcome to this quiet corner of history. Tonight, we set aside the noise of the present and wander gently into the stories of the past. Whether you're curled up beneath the blankets, resting after a long day, or simply seeking calm company for your evening, I'm grateful you've chosen to be here. If you'd like, share in the comments where in the world you're listening from. I always love seeing how far this community stretches across time zones and continents. And if these soothing journeys through history bring you comfort, consider subscribing so we can meet again. For now, let's loosen the weight of the modern world and step softly into the echoes of yesterday. Picture, if you will, a crisp $100 bill resting in your palm. Feel its distinctive texture, notice the careful engraving, the intricate patterns that speak of craftsmanship and trust. And there, gazing out at you with knowing eyes and the faintest suggestion of a smile, is not a president, not a general who commanded armies or a statesman who occupied the highest office in the land, but rather a printer's apprentice who ran away from home, a man who never attended university, who taught himself nearly everything he knew, who flew kites in thunderstorms and charmed the courts of Europe in a fur cap. Benjamin Franklin, of all the founders, of all the revolutionary heroes and architects of the American experiment, stands alone on the nation's most coveted currency, and tonight, we shall explore together why this is so, unraveling the threads of a story that reaches back through centuries of American memory, through wars and transformations, through decisions made in marble halls and quiet deliberations that shaped how a nation would remember itself. The answer to our question is not simple, not a matter of a single decree or obvious logic, but rather a tapestry woven from Franklin's extraordinary life, his unique position in American consciousness, the practical considerations of currency design, and the subtle ways that a society chooses its symbols. So settle deeper into your comfort, let your breathing slow and steady, and allow yourself to drift with me into the world that created both Benjamin Franklin and the curious honor that placed his face upon the bill that, more than any other, represents American prosperity and ambition. To understand why Franklin graces the $100 bill, we must first understand Franklin himself, and to understand Franklin, we must travel back to a different America entirely, to colonial Boston in the year 1706, to a world of wooden houses and cobblestone streets, of candles and fireplaces, of a society still finding its footing in the New World. Benjamin Franklin was born on a cold January day, the 15th child of 17 children born to Josiah Franklin, a chandler and soap maker who had emigrated from England seeking religious freedom and economic opportunity. Imagine the Franklin household, crowded and bustling, filled with the voices of siblings, the smell of tallow and lye, the constant activity of a large family making its way in a young colonial city. Young Benjamin showed his brilliance early, reading voraciously, writing with unusual clarity, questioning everything around him with an insatiable curiosity. His father, recognizing the boy's intellectual gifts but lacking the means to provide extensive formal education, apprenticed him at age 12 to his older brother James, a printer. Picture young Benjamin in that printing shop, the smell of ink and paper, the mechanical rhythm of the press, the way words transformed from abstract thought into physical reality, letter by letter, line by line. It was here, among the fonts and frames, that Franklin began to understand the power of the written word, the way ideas could spread and multiply, the way communication itself could shape society. But the apprenticeship was not happy. James Franklin was a harsh master, quick with his fists and stingy with his praise, and young Benjamin chafed under the restrictions of servitude. At 17, unable to bear his brother's tyranny any longer, Benjamin broke his apprenticeship contract and ran away, a decision that in those days carried serious legal and social consequences. He fled first to New York, finding no opportunities there, and then continued southward to Philadelphia, arriving in that city on a Sunday morning in October 1723, tired, hungry, with only a few coins in his pocket. The image of Franklin walking through Philadelphia for the first time has become iconic in American mythology, a young man carrying 3 puffy rolls under his arms, his pockets stuffed with extra shirts and socks, looking so disheveled and absurd that a young woman named Deborah Reed laughed at him from her doorway. This woman would later become his common-law wife, and Philadelphia would become his adopted home, the city forever associated with his name. Philadelphia in the 1720s was a very different place from the Boston he had left behind. Where Boston was Puritan and tradition-bound, Philadelphia was Quaker and relatively tolerant, a city built on principles of religious freedom and practical commerce. It was smaller than Boston but growing rapidly, its streets laid out in a neat grid that William Penn had designed, its harbor busy with ships arriving from England and the Caribbean. Franklin arrived with nothing but his intelligence, his work ethic, and his unshakable confidence in his own abilities, and he set about making himself indispensable. He found work in a printing shop, demonstrating such skill and reliability that he quickly became valued by his employer. But Franklin wanted more than to be an employee, he wanted to be his own master, to build something of his own. Through a combination of hard work, strategic thinking, and what he himself called industry and frugality, Franklin managed to establish his own printing business by 1730, at the age of 24. The shop became successful not merely because Franklin was skilled at the technical aspects of printing, but because he understood that a printing business was fundamentally about communication, about being at the center of information flow in the community. It was in 1732 that Franklin began publishing Poor Richard's Almanac, a yearly publication that would make him famous throughout the colonies and eventually across the Atlantic. Almanacs were essential tools in the 18th century, providing calendars, weather predictions, astronomical information, and practical advice that farmers, merchants, and households relied upon. But Franklin's almanac was different. Where others were dry and straightforward, Poor Richard's was witty, wise, and wonderfully entertaining. Franklin, writing under the pseudonym Richard Saunders, filled the margins with aphorisms that have echoed through American culture ever since. Early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. A penny saved is a penny earned. God helps those who help themselves. Fish and visitors stink after 3 days. These sayings might seem simple, even simplistic, but they represented something profound in the American character that was just beginning to form, a belief in self-improvement, practical wisdom, and the idea that success came not from birth or divine favor but from personal virtue and effort. Poor Richard's Almanac sold approximately 10,000 copies annually, an extraordinary number in colonial America where the entire population of Philadelphia was only about 15,000 people. Through this publication, Franklin's voice, his philosophy, his particular blend of humor and wisdom, reached into homes throughout the colonies, creating a shared cultural reference point and establishing Franklin as something more than a businessman. He was becoming a public philosopher, a voice of common sense and practical morality. But Franklin was never content to remain in a single domain. His curiosity was omnivorous, his energy seemingly boundless. Even as he built his printing business and raised his family, he had a son, William, born out of wedlock before his common-law marriage to Deborah, and then 2 more children with Deborah. Though only his daughter Sarah survived to adulthood, Franklin involved himself in civic improvement projects that transformed Philadelphia and set patterns for American civic life that continue to this day. Consider for a moment the range of Franklin's civic innovations. In 1731, he established the Library Company of Philadelphia, the first lending library in America, based on a beautifully simple idea. Individuals could pool their resources to purchase books that no single person could afford alone, creating a shared intellectual commons. This library, which still exists today, represented Franklin's democratic vision of knowledge. It should not be the exclusive possession of the wealthy or the clergy, but available to anyone willing to make the effort to read and learn. The subscription library model spread throughout the colonies, fundamentally changing the intellectual landscape of America. In 1736, Franklin organized the Union Fire Company, Philadelphia's first volunteer fire brigade. Fire was a constant and terrifying threat in colonial cities where buildings were primarily wood and heating and lighting depended on open flames. Franklin's fire company established the principle of neighbors banding together for mutual protection, each member pledging to respond when the alarm bell rang, to bring leather buckets and help pump water, to save not just one's own property but the community's. This model of volunteer civic organization became deeply embedded in American culture. In 1743, Franklin founded the American Philosophical Society, the first learned society in the colonies, dedicated to the pursuit of useful knowledge. This was the Enlightenment flowering in American soil, the belief that through reason, observation, and systematic inquiry, humanity could understand the natural world and improve the human condition. The society brought together the brightest minds in the colonies to share observations, conduct experiments, and advance knowledge in fields ranging from medicine to astronomy to agriculture. In 1751, Franklin helped establish Pennsylvania Hospital, the first public hospital in America, based on his conviction that healthcare should not be available only to those who could afford private physicians but should be accessible to the sick regardless of their ability to pay. The hospital was funded through a creative matching grant scheme that Franklin devised. Private donations would be matched by public funds from the Pennsylvania Assembly, pioneering a model of public-private partnership that remains common in American civic life. These weren't merely the hobbies of a wealthy man with time on his hands. Franklin saw civic improvement as both a moral duty and a form of enlightened self-interest. A city with educated citizens, protection from fire, institutions for the advancement of knowledge, and care for the sick was a better place for everyone, including successful printers. His approach to civic life was pragmatic and inclusive. He deliberately avoided founding these institutions along religious or ethnic lines, insisting they be open to all, recognizing that sectarian division weakened communities while cooperation strengthened them. But perhaps nothing burnished Franklin's reputation more brilliantly than his scientific work, particularly his investigations into electricity. In the 1740s and 50s, electricity was a fashionable curiosity, a mysterious force that natural philosophers across Europe were investigating with primitive equipment and limited understanding. Static electricity could be generated with friction, sparks could be drawn from charged objects, but no one understood what electricity actually was or how it worked. Franklin approached the subject with his characteristic combination of playfulness and rigor. He proposed that electricity was not two different fluids, as many believed, but a single fluid that could be present in excess, positive charge, or deficit, negative charge. He introduced the terms positive and negative charge, battery, and conductor that we still use today. He noticed similarities between electrical sparks and lightning. Both created light, made loud crackling sounds, traveled along conductors, and could kill. This led him to hypothesize that lightning was itself electrical in nature, a radical idea at the time. The experiment that Franklin is most famous for, the one that captured imaginations then and remains iconic now, came in 1752. The exact details have been somewhat mythologized. Franklin did not, as popular imagination sometimes suggests, directly fly a kite into a thunderstorm while holding a metal key, which almost certainly would have killed him. Rather, he conducted a carefully designed experiment in which a kite with a metal wire along its string was flown near, not in, a thunderstorm. The key was attached to the end of the string, and below the key was a silk ribbon that Franklin held, the silk being an insulator. When rain began to fall, making the string conductive, Franklin observed that loose threads on the string stood erect, indicating they were charged with electricity. He brought his knuckle near the key and drew a spark, demonstrating that lightning was indeed electrical in nature. This discovery was more than a scientific curiosity. Franklin immediately recognized its practical implications. If lightning was electrical, it could be controlled using the same principles that governed electrical experiments. He invented the lightning rod, a simple iron rod placed at the highest point of a building, connected by a wire to a metal stake driven into the ground. When lightning struck, the electrical charge would travel harmlessly down the wire and dissipate into the earth, rather than setting the building ablaze or destroying it with explosive force. This invention saved countless lives and immeasurable property. Buildings across America and Europe began installing Franklin's lightning rods, each one a small monument to the power of scientific inquiry to improve human life. Franklin's electrical experiments brought him international fame. The Royal Society of London, the most prestigious scientific institution in the world, awarded him their Copley Medal, their highest honor. Universities across Europe granted him honorary degrees. Here was an American, a colonial, a man without formal scientific training, making fundamental discoveries that advanced human knowledge. Franklin's scientific achievements did something profound for American self-conception. They demonstrated that intellectual brilliance was not the exclusive property of European universities and ancient institutions, but could flourish in the New World, that Americans were not merely provincial imitators but could be original contributors to human civilization. Yet even as Franklin pursued his scientific interests and managed his increasingly successful business enterprises, he was being drawn more deeply into politics and public affairs. The 1750s and 60s were a time of growing tension between the American colonies and the British government, as Parliament and the Crown increasingly sought to assert control over colonial affairs and extract revenue from colonial commerce. Franklin initially positioned himself as a mediator, someone who understood both British interests and colonial concerns, who believed that reason and negotiation could resolve conflicts. In 1757, Franklin traveled to London as an agent for the Pennsylvania Assembly, charged with representing colonial interests to the British government. This began a period of nearly 2 decades during which Franklin spent most of his time in England, becoming something of a transatlantic figure, at home in both Philadelphia and London. He moved through London society with remarkable ease for a colonial, dining with lords and scholars, conversing with the leading intellectuals of the age, charming nearly everyone he met with his wit, his wisdom, and his ability to tell a good story. He dressed simply but well, cultivating an image of American plainness and virtue that made him exotic and interesting to British society while also serving a diplomatic purpose. He was living proof that Americans were civilized, thoughtful people who deserved to be treated as equals rather than as subordinates. During these years, Franklin tried desperately to prevent the rupture between Britain and America. He argued against the Stamp Act, which imposed taxes on the colonies without their consent, testifying before Parliament in 1766 in a performance that was masterful in its combination of firmness and tact. He explained colonial objections, clarified misunderstandings, and helped secure the Act's repeal. But even as he worked for reconciliation, Franklin was slowly, reluctantly coming to the conclusion that the relationship between Britain and America might be fundamentally broken, that the British government viewed the colonies not as partners in an empire but as resources to be exploited. The breaking point came in 1774, when Franklin was publicly humiliated before the Privy Council for his role in releasing private letters from the Massachusetts governor that revealed plans to restrict colonial liberty. The experience was devastating. Franklin stood silent for over an hour while the Solicitor General verbally abused him, calling him a thief and worse, while the assembled officials laughed and jeered. This man, who had been honored by the Royal Society, who had been welcomed in the finest homes of London, was now treated as a criminal and a traitor. Franklin left England in 1775, returning to Philadelphia a changed man, his hopes for reconciliation extinguished, his commitment to American independence now absolute. When Franklin arrived back in Philadelphia in May 1775, the Revolutionary War had already begun. Shots had been fired at Lexington and Concord the previous month, and the colonies were rapidly organizing for armed resistance. Franklin, now 69 years old, an age when most men of his era were withdrawing from public life, threw himself into the revolutionary cause with total commitment. He was elected to the Second Continental Congress, where his reputation, his experience, and his wisdom made him one of the most influential delegates. In the summer of 1776, Franklin served on the committee tasked with drafting the Declaration of Independence. Though the primary author was the much younger Thomas Jefferson, Franklin's editorial touches improved the document in subtle but important ways. When Jefferson wrote that, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable," Franklin changed it to, "We hold these truths to be self-evident," a phrasing that was more direct, more confident, grounded in reason rather than religion. It was a small change, only a few words, but it captured something essential about the Enlightenment foundation of American independence. These truths needed no supernatural validation, they were evident to any rational observer. But Franklin's most crucial service to the Revolution came not in Congress but in France. In December 1776, as American military prospects looked increasingly grim, Franklin embarked on the most important diplomatic mission of his life. He sailed for France, braving winter storms and British naval patrols, to seek French support for the American cause. France had been defeated by Britain in the 7 Years' War and was eager for revenge, but the French court was cautious, unwilling to commit openly to the American rebels until it seemed they had some chance of success. Franklin's mission to France became one of the most successful diplomatic campaigns in American history. He arrived in Paris and was received with something approaching mania. The French had been reading Poor Richard's Almanac in translation for years, they knew of his electrical experiments, they saw him as the embodiment of Enlightenment ideals and New World virtue. Franklin understood the role he was expected to play. He dressed simply, wearing a fur cap rather than the powdered wigs fashionable in French society, presenting himself as a rustic philosopher from the American wilderness. The French ate it up. His image appeared on medallions, snuff boxes, and prints that sold throughout Paris. Women wore their hair in the style, à la Franklin. He became, in essence, America's first celebrity diplomat. But beneath the charm and celebrity was serious work. Franklin, assisted by John Adams and Arthur Lee, negotiated carefully with the French foreign minister, the Comte de Vergennes, working to secure not just diplomatic recognition but military and financial support for the American cause. The breakthrough came in February 1778, when France formally recognized American independence and signed a treaty of alliance that committed France to providing military support until independence was secured. This alliance transformed the Revolutionary War from a colonial rebellion into an international conflict, forcing Britain to divide its naval and military resources across multiple theaters. French money, arms, and eventually troops and naval power proved decisive in securing American independence. Franklin remained in France throughout the war, serving as America's minister plenipotentiary, managing the complex diplomatic relationships that kept the alliance functioning despite inevitable tensions. He was now in his 70s, suffering from gout and kidney stones that caused him constant pain, yet he maintained his diplomatic duties with grace and effectiveness. He negotiated loans that kept the Continental Army supplied, managed the complex web of French bureaucracy, corresponded with American leaders, and represented American interests to European powers. When the war finally ended in victory, Franklin was part of the American delegation that negotiated the Treaty of Paris in 1783, which formally recognized American independence and established boundaries far more favorable than the Americans had dared hope for. It was one of the most successful peace negotiations in diplomatic history, and Franklin's experience and wisdom were crucial to its success. Franklin finally returned to America in 1785, at age 79, after 9 years in France. He was welcomed as a hero, one of the handful of men whose efforts had made independence possible. But even in what should have been his retirement, Franklin continued to serve. In 1787, he was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention, the oldest member by far, in such poor health that he had to be carried to sessions in a sedan chair. He spoke rarely but effectively, using his prestige to broker compromises, to calm heated debates, to remind the delegates of their larger purpose. Franklin's most famous contribution to the convention came at its conclusion. Many delegates had reservations about the Constitution they had created, worried it gave too much power to the federal government or too little protection to individual rights. Franklin acknowledged these concerns in a speech he asked a colleague to read on his behalf. He was too weak to deliver it himself. He confessed that there were parts of the Constitution he didn't approve of, but he doubted whether any other convention could do better. He noted that the older he grew, the more apt he was to doubt his own judgment and to pay respect to the judgment of others. He urged all delegates to doubt a little of their own infallibility, and to sign the Constitution, adding famously that he consented to it, with all its faults, if they are such, because I think a general government necessary for us. This speech helped persuade several wavering delegates to sign, and the Constitution was approved. Franklin lived 4 more years, dying in April 1790, at age 84, one of the most famous men in the world. His funeral in Philadelphia drew the largest crowd the city had ever seen, and memorial services were held across America and Europe. The French Assembly wore mourning for 3 days, an unprecedented honor for a foreign commoner. The loss was felt deeply because Franklin had been more than a statesman or scientist. He had been a symbol of human possibility, proof that wisdom could come from anywhere, that birth and formal education were less important than character and effort, that an ordinary person could, through intelligence and virtue, accomplish extraordinary things. Now, having journeyed through Franklin's remarkable life, let us return to our original question: why does this man, rather than a president, grace the $100 bill? The answer begins to emerge from the story itself. Franklin was, in many ways, the complete American, embodying virtues that Americans have always claimed to admire: self-reliance, ingenuity, civic virtue, practical wisdom, and the belief that merit matters more than birth. But to fully understand his presence on the currency, we need to understand the history of American money and the processes by which faces are chosen for bills. The history of American currency is complex and surprisingly political. In the early years of the Republic, there was no national paper currency. Each bank issued its own notes, and hundreds of different designs circulated, creating confusion and opportunities for counterfeiting. During the Civil War, the federal government began issuing paper currency, greenbacks, to finance the war effort, and these gradually became standardized. The decision about whose faces would appear on these notes was made by the Secretary of the Treasury, with input from the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, and choices were guided partly by honor, partly by anti-counterfeiting considerations, and partly by the political sensibilities of the moment. In the 19th century, the faces on currency changed relatively frequently. Various presidents, statesmen, and even allegorical figures appeared and disappeared as new designs were issued. But starting in the early 20th century, a more stable system emerged. In 1928, the first small-size currency was issued. Prior bills had been larger and more elaborate. This 1928 redesign established most of the face assignments that we recognize today, and these have remained largely stable for nearly a century. Franklin first appeared on currency in 1869, on a $100 note, though this was in the earlier large-size format. When the 1928 redesign occurred, the choice was made to keep Franklin on the $100 bill. This decision reflected several considerations. First, the $100 bill was and remains the highest denomination in common circulation, and placing Franklin on it was a mark of high honor. Second, Franklin's face was already associated with the 100 in public consciousness from the earlier design, providing continuity. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Franklin represented values that the government wanted to associate with money itself: industry, frugality, and material success achieved through virtue and effort. But there's another reason, more subtle but equally important, why Franklin rather than a president occupies this space. The faces on currency serve partly as educational tools, reminding citizens of their history and values. The lower denominations feature presidents: Washington on the 1, Jefferson on the 2, Lincoln on the 5, Jackson on the 20, Grant on the 50, because presidents are easier for the public to remember and recognize, their terms providing natural bookmarks in the nation's timeline. But Franklin, by never being president, occupies a different category. He represents the idea that the highest contributions to the nation need not come from the highest office, that American greatness includes scientists, inventors, writers, and civic leaders, not just political executives. This is significant in a republic that has always been suspicious of concentrated power and wary of treating any office, even the presidency, with too much reverence. By placing Franklin on the highest denomination, the government implicitly acknowledged that American identity was richer and more complex than just its political leadership. Franklin represented intellectual achievement, scientific inquiry, diplomatic skill, and civic virtue, a different kind of contribution to the national project, but one equally worthy of honor. There's also something appropriate about Franklin being on money specifically. More than perhaps any other founder, Franklin understood commerce, finance, and the material basis of prosperity. His own life was a demonstration of how economic success, honestly gained, could provide the foundation for civic contributions and intellectual pursuits. He wrote extensively about money, economics, and finance, offering advice that was always practical and often profound. His essay, The Way to Wealth, compiled from Poor Richard's sayings, became one of the most widely read texts on economic life in the 18th century, translated into dozens of languages and still in print today. Franklin understood that money was not just a medium of exchange but a tool that could be used wisely or foolishly, that the discipline required to earn and save money was connected to the discipline required for self-government, both personal and political. He believed that a nation of people who worked hard, saved prudently, and invested wisely would be a nation capable of sustaining liberty, while a people addicted to luxury and debt would inevitably lose their independence. His presence on currency serves as a subtle reminder of these connections between economic virtue and political freedom. The $100 bill itself has interesting symbolism that resonates with Franklin's character. It's the bill associated with substantial transactions, with savings and investment, with the rewards of long effort rather than immediate gratification. It's not pocket change for daily expenses but something held in reserve, something that represents accumulated value. This fits Franklin perfectly. He was never about the quick score or the flashy display, but about steady accumulation, patient effort, compound growth over time. The $100 bill is saved, invested, used for important purchases, and Franklin would have approved of all these uses. Moreover, the $100 bill has become, in global consciousness, the symbol of American economic power. It's the currency that people around the world save, that refugees carry as portable wealth, that represents not just American money but the promise of American opportunity. That Franklin's face has become associated with this global symbol is fitting, because Franklin himself was the first American to achieve truly international fame, the first American to show the world that this new nation could produce people of world historical importance. The alternative, placing a president on the 100, would have sent a different message. Which president would be chosen? Washington already had the $1 bill, the most circulated currency, and Mount Rushmore, and the nation's capital city named after him. Lincoln had the 5 and his magnificent memorial. Jefferson had the 2 and his memorial. To give another president the 100 would either require choosing someone controversial, should it be FDR, whose New Deal some revere and others revile. Reagan, beloved by many but divisive. Or someone like William Henry Harrison or Millard Fillmore, worthy men perhaps but hardly representing the pinnacle of American achievement. Franklin, by contrast, was nearly universally admired, and his achievements were so varied that he could represent multiple aspects of American identity simultaneously. He was the practical inventor, the self-made businessman, the civic improver, the scientist, the writer, the diplomat, the revolutionary, the elder statesman. He was funny and wise, sophisticated yet humble, American yet cosmopolitan. His life spanned nearly the entire 18th century, from colonial subjection to national independence, and he had been instrumental in almost every important development in that transformation. There's another practical consideration in the choice of Franklin for the 100. He was easier to draw in the anti-counterfeiting portrait style used on currency. Franklin's face, with its distinctive features, the high forehead, the eyes that suggested both humor and wisdom, the firm mouth, was recognizable and reproducible in the engraving style. Presidents in military uniform or formal dress could look similar, but Franklin's civilian plainness made him distinctive. This might seem like a minor point, but currency design requires balancing honor, symbolism, and security considerations, and Franklin's appearance served all three purposes well. The $100 bill featuring Franklin has gone through several redesigns since 1928, each updating security features to combat increasingly sophisticated counterfeiting, but Franklin has remained constant through all these changes. The most recent major redesign, in 2013, added a three-dimensional security ribbon, a color-shifting bell and an inkwell, and other advanced features, making it one of the most secure banknotes in the world. Yet through all these technological improvements, Franklin's portrait remains, anchoring the bill in historical continuity. It's worth noting that the decision to keep Franklin on the 100 hasn't been entirely without controversy. There have been periodic calls to put different figures on American currency, to include women, people of color, and others whose contributions have been underrepresented in the nation's symbolic representations. The Treasury Department announced in 2016 that Harriet Tubman would appear on the $20 bill, replacing Andrew Jackson, though this change has been delayed and its ultimate implementation remains uncertain. But even these proposals have generally left Franklin undisturbed on the 100, suggesting a consensus that his presence there is appropriate and should continue. This consensus reflects something important about how Franklin fits into American memory. Unlike many historical figures whose reputations have fluctuated as historians have uncovered their flaws and contradictions, Franklin has remained relatively stable in public esteem. This isn't because Franklin was perfect, he wasn't. He fathered an illegitimate child and was often an absent father and husband. He could be vain and manipulative. He owned slaves for part of his life, though he later became an abolitionist and president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. He had petty rivalries and made political miscalculations. But somehow these human failings have never seriously damaged his reputation, perhaps because Franklin himself was so honest about his imperfections. In his famous autobiography, which he began in 1771 and worked on intermittently for the rest of his life, Franklin presented himself not as a perfect sage but as a work in progress, someone trying to improve himself through systematic effort. He described his plan for achieving moral perfection, listing 13 virtues he wanted to cultivate: temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, chastity, and humility. He created a chart to track his daily progress and admitted frankly that he never achieved perfection, that certain virtues like order consistently eluded him. This honesty about his failures made him more rather than less admirable, because it showed that virtue was a practice, not a state, something you worked at daily, knowing you would often fall short. This aspect of Franklin's character, his commitment to self-improvement, his belief that people could deliberately become better versions of themselves, has particular resonance in American culture. America has always been a nation of self-help books, improvement schemes, fresh starts, and second chances. The idea that your origins don't determine your destiny, that you can reinvent yourself through effort and will, is deeply embedded in American mythology, and Franklin was perhaps the first and certainly the most famous example of this possibility. A runaway apprentice became a wealthy businessman. A colonial with no formal education became an honored scientist. A provincial printer became a diplomat who charmed the courts of Europe. If Franklin could do it, the implicit message goes, perhaps anyone could. This is why Franklin resonates particularly with immigrant communities and others coming to America with little more than ambition and work ethic. His face on the $100 bill represents the promise that America offers, not guaranteed success, but the opportunity to succeed if you work hard, think clearly, and contribute to your community. This promise has always been more myth than reality, more accessible to some than others, but it remains powerful in American self-conception, and Franklin remains its primary symbol. The $100 bill itself has an interesting cultural life that reflects and reinforces Franklin's symbolic importance. In hip-hop culture, the 100 is the Benjamin, collapsing the bill and the men into a single term that represents success, wealth, and having made it. When rappers talk about Benjamins or counting Benjamins, they're invoking Franklin as the symbol of financial achievement, though probably few could tell you much about his actual life. This usage, while perhaps not what Franklin would have chosen, nonetheless shows how his image on currency has given him a kind of cultural immortality, his name and face remaining current and relevant centuries after his death. The $100 bill also appears frequently in film and television as a visual shorthand for various concepts: serious money, bribes, payoffs, savings, or investment. When a character pulls out hundreds, we know they mean business. When hundreds are stacked and bound, we're looking at serious wealth or criminal proceeds. When someone refuses hundreds, we know their motives are not financial. Franklin's face witnesses all these transactions in fiction and reality, a silent observer of American economic life in all its variety. Internationally, the $100 bill, and thus Franklin, has become the de facto symbol of American economic power. In countries with unstable currencies, people save in dollars, specifically in $100 bills, because they're the most efficient way to store value in a small space. In many parts of the world, major transactions are conducted in $100 bills rather than local currency. This means that Franklin's face is recognized in villages and cities across the globe, perhaps more widely recognized than any current American political leader. In this sense, Franklin has achieved a form of immortality that exceeds even that of most presidents. His image circulates through the global economy, representing American stability and value wherever it goes. The decision to feature Franklin on the 100 rather than a president also sidesteps some of the political difficulties that presidential choices inevitably involve. Presidents are necessarily political figures. They made decisions that benefited some groups and harmed others, that advanced some values and compromised others. Their inclusion on currency can become contentious as historical judgments shift. Andrew Jackson on the $20 bill has become controversial because of his brutal treatment of Native Americans. Grant on the 50 raises questions about his presidency's corruption even as it honors his military service. Washington and Lincoln are relatively safe choices, but even they made decisions that historians debate and some citizens disapprove of. Franklin, having never been president, avoided making many of the zero-sum political decisions that presidents must make. He didn't have to choose which states' interests to prioritize or which groups to protect at the expense of others. His contributions, scientific discoveries, civic improvements, diplomatic achievements, were largely additive, making things better without necessarily making other things worse. This gives him a kind of political neutrality that presidents can never quite achieve, making him a safer choice for a symbol that all Americans are asked to accept and use. There's also something fitting about the fact that Franklin's presence on the $100 bill ensures that the most common question asked about him is precisely the one we've been exploring tonight: why is Franklin on the $100 bill and not a president? This question itself becomes educational, prompting people to learn about Franklin, to discover his remarkable life, to understand that American greatness takes many forms. In this sense, Franklin's presence on the currency serves an ongoing pedagogical function, teaching each new generation about the breadth of American achievement and the variety of ways one can contribute to the national project. The Bureau of Engraving and Printing, which produces American currency, has occasionally been asked whether Franklin might be replaced, whether it's time to update the faces on bills to reflect a more diverse America. These are reasonable questions, and there are many figures, women, people of color, and others, whose contributions deserve recognition on the nation's currency. Yet when these discussions occur, Franklin generally seems to escape reconsideration. There's a sense that his position is earned, that his face on the $100 bill reflects something genuine about American values and history, that removing him would actually impoverish the symbolic meaning of the currency rather than updating or correcting it. This doesn't mean that other denominations shouldn't change. Adding new faces to represent the full diversity of American achievement is entirely compatible with keeping Franklin where he is. The $20 bill may soon feature Harriet Tubman, which would be a powerful and appropriate recognition of her courage and her role in American freedom. Other denominations could feature figures like Eleanor Roosevelt, Martin Luther King Jr., or Susan B. Anthony. But Franklin on the 100 seems to occupy a different category, representing not just historical achievement but something about the American character itself, its ingenuity, its optimism, its belief in self-improvement and practical wisdom. Let us consider for a moment what would be lost if Franklin were removed from the $100 bill. We would lose a visual reminder that scientific achievement and intellectual contribution are valued as highly as political leadership. We would lose the symbolism of the self-made person, the individual who rises through merit rather than birth. We would lose the connection to America's founding generation, to the revolutionary spirit that created the nation. We would lose the international recognition that Franklin's face has achieved, the way that people around the world have come to associate his image with American currency and American values. These would be genuine losses, not easily compensated by whatever new symbol might replace him. There's also the question of what Franklin himself would have thought about his presence on the $100 bill. We can't know for certain, of course, but we can make educated guesses based on his character and writings. Franklin was not falsely modest. He knew his own worth and enjoyed recognition, but he was also suspicious of excessive honors and monuments. He preferred useful recognition to empty ceremony, things that actually accomplished something rather than mere display. Being on currency would likely have appealed to him precisely because money is useful, because it circulates and does work in the economy rather than sitting static like a statue in a park. His face on the 100 serves a purpose. It makes the bill recognizable and harder to counterfeit, while also conveying meaning. This combination of utility and symbolism would have suited Franklin's practical temperament. Moreover, Franklin understood money and its role in society better than most of his contemporaries. He had written the pamphlet, A Modest Inquiry into the Nature and Necessity of a Paper Currency, back in 1729, arguing for the economic benefits of paper money when most people still trusted only gold and silver. He understood that money was ultimately a social construction, valuable because communities agreed it was valuable, and that this collective agreement could be a powerful tool for economic development. To have his face become part of that collective agreement, to have his image serve as one of the foundations of monetary trust, would likely have pleased him as an appropriate recognition of his understanding of these issues. Franklin also would have appreciated the irony that the men who wrote, "A penny saved is a penny earned," ended up on the $100 bill rather than the penny. There's a certain humor in this that Franklin, who loved wordplay and irony, would have enjoyed. His aphorisms about thrift and frugality are now carried on the bill that represents substantial wealth, suggesting perhaps that those who follow his advice about pennies may eventually accumulate Benjamins. The endurance of Franklin on the $100 bill also tells us something about the stability and continuity of American symbols. In an age of constant change, when technology, culture, and politics seem to transform at dizzying speed, the faces on currency provide a kind of anchor, a reminder that some things remain constant across generations. Children today see the same Franklin that their grandparents saw, and their grandparents saw essentially the same Franklin that was chosen in 1928. This continuity across nearly a century suggests that the choice was fundamentally sound, that Franklin represents something essential rather than merely fashionable. Yet we should also acknowledge the ways that Franklin's meaning has shifted over time, how different generations have emphasized different aspects of his legacy. In the 19th century, Franklin was primarily remembered as a moral exemplar, the author of Poor Richard's Wisdom, the advocate of industry and frugality. This was the Franklin that self-improvement manuals cited, that parents invoked when teaching their children about virtue and success. In the early 20th century, as America became more scientific and technological, Franklin was remembered primarily as a scientist and inventor, the man who harnessed electricity and proved that Americans could contribute to scientific progress. In the mid-20th century, during the Cold War, Franklin became important as a diplomat and statesman, someone who had secured crucial international support for American independence, relevant to an age when international alliances seemed essential to national survival. Today, in the 21st century, Franklin's image has become more complex and multifaceted. We appreciate all these aspects of his achievement, the moral wisdom, the scientific curiosity, the diplomatic skill, but we also see him more clearly as a human being with contradictions and flaws. We recognize that his aphorisms about frugality coexisted with his love of fine wine and good living, that his advocacy for American rights included years of hoping for reconciliation with Britain, that his commitment to Enlightenment ideals existed alongside his ownership of slaves. This more nuanced view doesn't diminish Franklin so much as humanize him, making his achievements more rather than less impressive because we see them as the accomplishments of a real person rather than a plaster saint. This evolution in how we understand Franklin suggests that his presence on the $100 bill remains vital precisely because each generation can find something relevant in his life and work. He's not a frozen symbol from a dead past but a living presence in American memory, someone whose life continues to speak to contemporary concerns and questions. The entrepreneur sees Franklin as a model of innovation and business success. The scientist sees him as a pioneering researcher. The civic activist sees him as an exemplar of community engagement. The diplomat sees him as a master of international relations. The writer sees him as a craftsman of prose. The humorist appreciates his wit. Each finds something authentic in Franklin, not just projecting their values onto him but discovering aspects of his actual character and achievement. The $100 bill itself, as a physical object, carries this multiplicity of meanings. Hold one in your hand and really look at it. Franklin's portrait dominates the front, but it's surrounded by other imagery: Independence Hall on the back, the Liberty Bell, subtle geometric patterns, security features that shimmer and shift in the light. Together these elements create a visual argument about American identity, independence, liberty, historical continuity, innovation, and security all woven together, with Franklin's face anchoring it all. The bill becomes a miniature civics lesson, a portable piece of American culture that teaches even as it facilitates commerce. There's something profound in the fact that Franklin's last major contribution was to the Constitution, that document that continues to structure American government more than 2 centuries after its drafting. His final political act was to urge compromise, to ask delegates to doubt their own infallibility, to support an imperfect document because perfection was unattainable and something was better than nothing. This wisdom, the willingness to accept the good enough rather than holding out for the impossible ideal, the recognition that in politics compromise is not weakness but wisdom, is perhaps more relevant now than ever. That the face on the $100 bill belongs to someone who embodied this practical wisdom rather than ideological purity seems appropriate for a nation that must constantly balance competing interests and values. Consider also the way Franklin's life models the possibility of growth and change. He was not born enlightened or wise but became so through deliberate effort and experience. His views on slavery evolved from acceptance to opposition. His understanding of British-American relations shifted from hoping for reconciliation to supporting independence. His scientific theories developed and refined over time. He made mistakes, acknowledged them, and adjusted course. This pattern of learning and growth is fundamentally optimistic. It suggests that people and nations can improve, that we're not locked into our initial positions, that wisdom can be acquired through experience. Having this model of adaptive intelligence on the $100 bill reminds us that flexibility and learning are virtues, not weaknesses. The practical uses of the $100 bill also matter to its symbolism. Unlike smaller denominations that are spent quickly on daily transactions, hundreds are typically used for significant purchases, saved for emergencies, or invested for the future. This aligns perfectly with Franklin's emphasis on planning ahead, on deferred gratification, on thinking beyond immediate needs to long-term security. The $100 bill represents not just money but money that's been accumulated, saved, used strategically. It's the bill that represents financial maturity and responsibility, values that Franklin championed throughout his life. In international contexts, the $100 bill, Franklin's face, has become almost a global currency, accepted in places where local money is distrusted, serving as a store of value that transcends national boundaries. This international role would have resonated with Franklin, who was himself transnational, at home in Philadelphia and London and Paris, someone who saw himself not just as an American or a Pennsylvanian but as a citizen of the world, a participant in the global republic of letters and ideas. That his image has achieved this global circulation would likely have pleased him as a confirmation that American contributions to human civilization were recognized beyond American borders. We might also consider the negative space around our question, why not a president on the 100? What does this absence signify? It suggests that the American system, at least in its symbolic representations, acknowledges that the presidency is not the sum total of American achievement, that the nation's greatness includes contributions from outside formal political office. This is healthy in a republic, reminding us that citizenship includes more than voting and that contribution includes more than seeking or holding office. Scientists, writers, inventors, educators, civic organizers, all these roles are valuable and worthy of honor. Franklin's presence on the currency validates these non-political forms of achievement. There's also a safeguard here against the cult of personality that can develop around presidents. By reserving the highest value commonly circulated bill for a non-president, the Treasury established a subtle check against presidential glorification. Yes, presidents appear on currency, but the $100 bill, the one that's saved and treasured, that represents serious wealth, features someone who succeeded outside the presidential system. This sends a message about American values that's worth preserving. Political power is not the highest good, the presidency is not the pinnacle of human achievement, and a free people honors multiple forms of excellence. The decision-making process around currency design itself reflects American values about representation and memory. The Secretary of the Treasury has final authority over whose faces appear on bills, but this decision is influenced by recommendations from the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, by congressional sentiment, by public opinion, and by historical consensus. It's not a purely top-down decision but emerges from a kind of national conversation about who deserves to be remembered and why. That Franklin has survived every reconsideration, every redesign, every shift in political winds, suggests a genuine consensus that his presence is appropriate and valuable. This consensus is remarkable when you consider how divisive most historical figures eventually become. Thomas Jefferson, brilliant author of the Declaration of Independence, was also a slaveholder whose relationship with Sally Hemings raises profound questions about consent and power. Andrew Jackson, lauded by some as a champion of the common man, orchestrated the Trail of Tears. Even Lincoln, perhaps the most revered president, made decisions during the Civil War that curtailed civil liberties in ways that trouble many Americans. But Franklin, while not perfect, seems to escape the kind of bitter controversy that eventually surrounds most historical figures. Perhaps this is because his achievements were primarily additive. He invented things, discovered things, wrote things, founded things, helped create things, rather than commanding armies or exercising political power in ways that necessarily created winners and losers. There's also the matter of Franklin's writing, which keeps him alive in ways that other founders are not. We read Franklin not just to learn about his time but because his prose remains engaging and often funny. Poor Richard's sayings still circulate because they're witty and memorable. His autobiography is still assigned in schools because it's actually interesting, not just historically important. His letters and essays remain readable and entertaining. This literary immortality complements his presence on currency. His words circulate through the culture just as his face circulates through the economy, both keeping him present in ways that memorial statues or historical markers never could. The $100 bill also participates in various cultural rituals and milestones that give it additional meaning. It's the bill that grandparents give as special gifts, that represents a significant birthday or graduation. It's what you receive as a bonus or save for a special purchase. It's associated with achievement and reward in ways that smaller bills are not. These patterns of use create emotional associations. The $100 bill means something has been earned, that effort has been rewarded, that success has been achieved. Franklin's face presides over these moments of financial accomplishment, linking his emphasis on industry and frugality to contemporary experiences of earning and saving. In popular culture, the transformation of Franklin into the Benjamin reveals how currency becomes language. When someone says they need Benjamins, they're not thinking about the historical Franklin or his achievements. They're using his name as shorthand for money itself, for financial success, for having made it. This linguistic transformation shows how completely Franklin has become associated with currency in American culture. His identity has partially merged with money itself, so that his name can stand in for the thing his face appears on. It's a kind of immortality, though perhaps not the kind Franklin would have chosen. His name has become a synonym for wealth rather than wisdom. Yet there's a deeper connection here than might first appear. Franklin wrote extensively about the relationship between virtue and prosperity, arguing that they were connected, that the discipline and foresight required to earn and manage money were the same qualities required for self-governance and citizenship. When we use Benjamins to mean money, we're unconsciously preserving this connection, linking the men who preached economic virtue to the currency that represents economic success. The slang usage, while superficial, carries echoes of Franklin's actual philosophy. The security features built into modern $100 bills also carry meaning worth considering. The bill is designed to be difficult to counterfeit, incorporating advanced technology and sophisticated design elements. This emphasis on security reflects Franklin's own concern with trust and reliability in currency. He had argued back in 1729 that paper money required public confidence to function, that its value depended on people trusting that it would be accepted and that it couldn't be easily faked. The advanced security features of the modern $100 bill, the security ribbon, the color-shifting bell, the watermark, the microprinting, all serve to maintain that essential trust. Franklin would have understood and appreciated these measures, recognizing them as necessary protections for the public confidence that makes currency possible. The redesigns of the $100 bill over the decades also tell a story about continuity and change. Each redesign has updated security features, adjusted colors and patterns, added new anti-counterfeiting measures, but Franklin's portrait has remained constant. This pattern, change in service of preserving function, innovation to maintain tradition, would have appealed to Franklin's practical mind. He was never a traditionalist for tradition's sake but recognized that some things should be preserved even as others must change. The continuous presence of his image amid technological updating embodies this balance between continuity and innovation. We should also consider the international implications of Franklin remaining on the $100 bill. American currency, particularly the $100 bill, is held and used worldwide. In countries experiencing economic instability, people convert their savings to dollars. In international trade, transactions are often conducted in dollars. The $100 bill is a global instrument, and Franklin's face on it represents America to people who may never visit the United States, who may know little about American history, but who trust American currency more than their own. This is a form of soft power, a way that America influences the world not through military might or political pressure but through economic stability and trust. That the face on this instrument of soft power is Franklin, a scientist, writer, and diplomat rather than a military or political leader, sends a subtle message about what America represents in the world. Think about what it means that people in Vietnam or Nigeria or Argentina who have never studied American history, who cannot name all the presidents, nonetheless recognize Franklin's face because they've handled $100 bills. His image has achieved a kind of universal recognition that transcends cultural and linguistic boundaries. He's become, in a sense, the face of American economic power, and by extension, one of the faces of America itself. This is a remarkable achievement for someone who died in 1790, more than 2 centuries ago, to remain not just remembered but actively present in global consciousness. The question of representation on currency is also a question about national memory. Who do we choose to remember, and by remembering them, what do we say about ourselves? Franklin on the $100 bill is a choice, renewed with each generation that keeps him there, about what Americans value or at least what we claim to value. We're saying that we value scientific inquiry, civic virtue, self-improvement, practical wisdom, diplomatic skill, and the possibility of rising from humble origins to great achievement. Whether Americans actually live up to these values is debatable, but by keeping Franklin on the currency, we at least acknowledge them as ideals worth aspiring to. There's also something to be said for the fact that Franklin's face is familiar without being oppressive. We see presidents constantly, their images dominate news coverage, their words fill the discourse, they're inescapable during their terms in office. There's a risk of oversaturation, of presidential faces becoming so common that they lose meaning. But Franklin exists at a different frequency. We encounter him mainly through currency, through occasional historical references, through the stories we tell about American achievement. His presence is steady but not overwhelming, familiar but retaining some mystery. This measured presence seems appropriate for someone who valued moderation and avoided the spotlight's glare while still contributing enormously to public life. The infrastructure required to change the face on currency is also worth considering. Millions of vending machines, bill validators, ATMs, and other automated systems are programmed to recognize the current $100 bill, including Franklin's portrait. Changing the design would require massive updating of this equipment worldwide. This creates a kind of institutional inertia that makes change difficult and expensive. But this practical consideration actually reinforces the symbolic point. Franklin has become so integrated into American economic infrastructure, so fundamental to how money moves through the system, that removing him would be disruptive not just symbolically but practically. His presence has become load-bearing in both cultural and technical senses. Let us also consider what Franklin represents in terms of American exceptionalism, that complex and controversial idea that America is somehow unique or special among nations. Franklin's life seems to validate a particular version of exceptionalism, not that Americans are inherently superior to others, but that America offered, and hopefully still offers, unusual opportunities for people to develop their potential regardless of their origins. Franklin wasn't born special, he became special through effort, opportunity, and the relatively open society of colonial Philadelphia. His story suggests that what's exceptional about America isn't the people but the system, the possibilities, the openness to talent regardless of pedigree. This is a more defensible version of exceptionalism, one that points not to inherent superiority but to specific institutional arrangements and cultural values that can, when functioning properly, enable human flourishing. The $100 bill in Franklin's time would have been an extraordinary sum, several months' wages for a working person, enough to purchase substantial goods or make a significant investment. Today, while $100 is still substantial, it's not beyond the reach of ordinary people, not exclusively the province of the wealthy. This democratization of access to higher denomination currency mirrors broader changes in American society, the expansion of the middle class and the spread of prosperity, however uneven, across larger portions of the population. Franklin, who argued that wealth should be earned through merit rather than inherited through birth, would likely have approved of this democratization, this idea that the $100 bill should be something that ordinary people could realistically hope to accumulate through their efforts. Yet we must also acknowledge the tensions and contradictions here. America has never fully lived up to the ideals that Franklin represents. Opportunity has never been equally distributed, privilege and disadvantage are passed down through generations, systemic barriers prevent many from rising as Franklin did. The presence of Franklin on the $100 bill can be read as aspirational. This is what we claim to be. These are the values we profess, even if we often fall short in practice. Or it can be read as ideological, a story we tell ourselves to justify inequality by suggesting that anyone who doesn't succeed simply didn't work hard enough, failing to acknowledge the structural advantages and disadvantages that shape life chances. Franklin himself evolved on questions of equality and justice. His ownership of slaves early in life gave way to abolitionism later. His initial dismissiveness of Native American cultures was replaced by more nuanced understanding. He came to advocate for public education because he recognized that opportunity required more than just personal effort, it required social institutions that equipped people to take advantage of opportunities. This evolution, this willingness to change his views based on experience and reflection, is part of what makes Franklin admirable and also part of what makes him a complex symbol rather than a simple one. The $100 bill thus carries multiple layers of meaning, some complementary, some contradictory. It represents achievement and aspiration, continuity and change, American ideals and American realities, historical memory and present concerns. Franklin's face anchors all these meanings, his multifaceted life and character allowing him to represent different things to different people while maintaining enough coherence that he remains recognizable and meaningful as a symbol. As we approach the end of our journey tonight, let us reflect on what we've discovered. We began with a simple question. Why does Benjamin Franklin, rather than a president, appear on the $100 bill? We found that the answer is layered and complex, involving Franklin's extraordinary achievements, his unique position in American history and consciousness, the practical considerations of currency design, and the subtle ways that societies choose their symbols and construct their collective memory. Franklin earned his place on the currency through a life of remarkable breadth and accomplishment. He was a scientist whose discoveries advanced human knowledge, an inventor whose creations improved daily life, a writer whose words shaped American culture, a civic leader whose institutions strengthened communities, a diplomat whose skills secured American independence, and a statesman whose wisdom helped create the constitutional framework that still governs the nation. Few individuals in history have contributed so significantly in so many different domains, and this breadth of achievement makes Franklin uniquely suited to represent American ideals on currency that circulates throughout the economy and around the world. But Franklin's presence on the $100 bill is more than just a reward for past achievements. It's a statement about American values, a reminder that the highest form of achievement isn't necessarily political power, that contributions to science, literature, civic life, and diplomacy are equally worthy of honor. By placing Franklin rather than a president on the highest denomination in common circulation, America acknowledges that greatness takes many forms and that the Republic values multiple kinds of excellence. The choice also reflects practical wisdom about currency design and anti-counterfeiting measures, about the need for recognizable faces that carry meaning without becoming controversial, about balancing honor with functionality. Franklin's distinctive features, his near-universal admiration, and his association with themes of thrift and prosperity make him ideally suited for currency in ways that go beyond mere historical importance. Moreover, Franklin's continued presence across nearly a century of currency redesign suggests that the choice has proven sound, that he represents something enduring in American identity rather than merely reflecting the prejudices or blind spots of a particular historical moment. Each generation has found reason to keep him there, discovering in his multifaceted life and character qualities that remain relevant and inspiring. The $100 bill itself has become more than mere currency. It's a cultural artifact, a teaching tool, a symbol that appears in art and music and literature, that participates in rituals of gift-giving and saving, that represents American economic power to people around the world. Franklin's face on this instrument carries meanings that accumulate and evolve, connecting past to present, linking the revolutionary generation to contemporary America, reminding us of ideals even as we grapple with the gap between ideals and reality. In the quiet of this evening, as you hold these thoughts like precious coins in the palm of your mind, consider what it means that a nation chooses to remember itself through currency, through the faces it places on the bills and coins that pass through millions of hands each day. These choices are never merely decorative or automatic but reflect deliberate decisions about national identity, about which stories to tell and which values to emphasize. Franklin on the $100 bill tells a story about America that emphasizes self-improvement over inherited privilege, practical wisdom over abstract theory, civic virtue over pure self-interest, intellectual achievement alongside political leadership. It's a story that contains genuine truth about American possibilities even as it sometimes obscures American failures. It's a story that has inspired millions to believe that they too could rise, could contribute, could matter, even as structural barriers have made that rising far more difficult for some than for others. The bill itself, worn and creased from passage through countless wallets and purses, carries the accumulated energy of all the transactions it has facilitated, all the dreams it has represented, all the savings and spending and gifting and earning that have marked its journey through the economy. And Franklin's face, gazing out with that slight smile that suggests he knows something we don't, has witnessed all of it, the prosperity and the poverty, the honest dealings and the corrupt ones, the dreams fulfilled and the hopes deferred. Perhaps what's most remarkable is that Franklin would likely have understood all of this complexity. He was never a simple man or a simple symbol. He contained multitudes, as all interesting people do, contradictions and consistencies, virtues and vices, wisdom earned through experience and folly committed despite knowledge. He would have recognized that his presence on currency carried symbolic weight but also practical implications, that it reflected both genuine achievement and mythological construction, that it meant different things to different people and that this multiplicity of meaning was not a weakness but a strength. If we could somehow speak with Franklin, could ask him what he thought about his enduring presence on the $100 bill, I imagine he might respond with characteristic humor and humility, perhaps quoting one of his own proverbs about the vanity of earthly honors, while secretly being quite pleased that his contributions were remembered. He might point out that of all possible forms of remembrance, appearing on currency at least serves a useful function, unlike a statue that merely gathers pigeon droppings. He might note the irony that the men who wrote endless aphorisms about thrift and saving now appears on the bill most associated with substantial wealth. And he might wonder what his presence there teaches new generations about American values and possibilities. The question we began with, why Franklin and not a president, thus opens into larger questions about how nations remember themselves, about the relationship between political power and other forms of achievement, about the ways that symbols accumulate meaning over time, about the gap between mythological figures and historical people, about how currency functions not just as a medium of exchange but as a medium of memory and meaning. In keeping Franklin on the $100 bill generation after generation, America makes a choice, renewed continually, about what it values and who it wants to remember. It's a choice that honors scientific inquiry, civic virtue, diplomatic skill, literary achievement, and self-made success. It's a choice that recognizes that greatness can emerge from unexpected places, that formal credentials matter less than actual contribution, that the presidency is not the only or necessarily the highest form of service to the republic. Whether this choice will continue into the future remains to be seen. Currency designs do change, and there are compelling arguments for including more diverse figures on American money, for representing the full breadth of American achievement including voices and perspectives that have been historically marginalized. But even if Franklin eventually shares his denomination or moves to a different one, his long tenure on the $100 bill will remain a significant chapter in how America has remembered itself, a window into the values and stories that have shaped national identity. For now, though, Franklin remains, His face instantly recognizable to Americans and people around the world, his image inextricably linked with American currency and American economic power. The runaway apprentice who arrived in Philadelphia with nothing but ambition and intelligence has become, in a sense, the face of American prosperity, the symbol on the bill that represents success, savings, and substantial wealth. It's a journey that would have seemed impossible to young Benjamin walking through Philadelphia carrying those 3 puffy rolls, and yet it's exactly the kind of improbable rise that his own life story was meant to inspire. As you drift towards sleep now, perhaps you'll dream of Franklin in his various incarnations, the young printer setting type by candlelight, the curious scientist flying a kite in a storm, the aging diplomat charming French salons in his fur cap, the wise elder urging compromise at the Constitutional Convention. Or perhaps you'll simply see his face as it appears on currency, that familiar portrait rendered in intricate engraving, those knowing eyes that have watched over so many transactions, so many dreams, so many exchanges of value and meaning. The $100 bill, after all, is more than just paper and ink, more than just a promise from the Treasury backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. It's an artifact of collective memory, a portable piece of American culture, a teaching tool that prompts questions like the one we've explored tonight. And Franklin's presence on it connects us to the revolutionary generation, to the men and women who created this nation and established its founding principles, reminding us that we are inheritors of a tradition that values practical wisdom, civic virtue, intellectual achievement, and the possibility, never fully realized but never entirely abandoned, that merit can triumph over privilege, that talent can overcome disadvantage, that a life well lived can echo through the centuries. In the gentle darkness that surrounds you now, as your breathing slows and deepens, as the concerns of the day recede like tide from shore, carry with you this thought: symbols matter. The faces we choose for our currency, the monuments we build, the stories we tell about our past, all these shape how we understand ourselves and what we believe is possible. Franklin on the $100 bill is one such symbol, carrying within it layers of meaning about American identity, American values, and American dreams. He earned his place there not through a single decisive action but through a lifetime of accumulated contributions, through being useful and thoughtful and curious, through combining personal success with public service, through demonstrating that one person, starting with nothing, could make profound differences in the world through intelligence, effort, and civic virtue. That this message remains relevant more than 2 centuries after his death, that new generations continue to find inspiration in his example, suggests that something essential in his life and character speaks to enduring human aspirations, the desire to understand, to improve, to contribute, to matter. And so Franklin remains on the $100 bill, not through institutional inertia or thoughtless tradition, but through a continual choosing, generation after generation, to keep him there, to maintain his presence as a reminder of what America claims to value and what Americans might aspire to become. He represents not what we are but what we might be, a nation where talent and effort matter more than birth, where intellectual achievement is honored alongside political power, where practical wisdom guides public affairs, where civic virtue balances private interest, where science and reason illuminate the path forward. These ideals are imperfectly realized, as all ideals must be when they meet the complexity of actual human societies. But they remain worth aspiring to, worth remembering, worth honoring through symbols like Franklin's presence on currency. And perhaps, in some small way, encountering his face on a $100 bill prompts people to wonder about his story, to learn about his achievements, to consider what his presence there signifies, and thereby to engage with questions about values, memory, achievement, and possibility that are essential to any society's understanding of itself. Rest now in the knowledge that history is not dead and gone but lives in these symbols that surround us, in the currency we use and the stories we tell, in the faces we choose to remember and the values we claim to honor. Franklin's journey from runaway apprentice to honored founder, from printer's shop to international fame, from colonial subject to revolutionary statesman, reminds us that lives can change, that people can grow, that contributions can accumulate into legacies that outlast their makers by centuries. As your consciousness drifts now towards sleep, floating on gentle currents of thought and memory, let Franklin's example, his curiosity, his civic virtue, his practical wisdom, his humor, his capacity for growth and change, settle into your awareness like a benediction, a reminder that each life contains possibilities, that contributions matter, that the work of building and improving and creating continues across generations, linking past to present to future in an unbroken chain of human effort and aspiration. The $100 bill will continue its circulation tomorrow, passing from hand to hand, facilitating commerce, representing value, carrying Franklin's face into countless transactions and exchanges. And in that circulation, in that constant movement through the economy and through the world, Franklin's memory remains active and present rather than fossilized in history books, his image touching lives in ways both mundane and meaningful, both practical and symbolic. Sleep well, dear friend, in the comfort of knowing that history lives not just in distant archives but in the everyday objects we handle and use, that the past speaks to the present through symbols like currency, and that the choices we make about what to remember and how to remember it shape the future we're creating. Franklin on the $100 bill is one such choice, renewed continually, connecting us to the revolutionary generation while prompting questions about contemporary values and future possibilities. Let these thoughts settle gently into the quiet spaces of your mind as you drift toward rest. Let the story of Franklin's remarkable life, from printer's apprentice to honored founder, from colonial to revolutionary, from local leader to international figure, remind you of human capacity for growth and contribution. Let his presence on the currency we use daily serve as a gentle prompt to consider what we value, what we remember, and what we hope to become. And as you surrender now to sleep's embrace, as consciousness fades like candlelight at dawn's approach, carry with you this final thought: the question of why Franklin appears on the $100 bill, which seemed so simple when we began, has opened into a meditation on memory, achievement, values, symbols, and the ways that nations tell stories about themselves. The answer is not simple because history is not simple, because symbols accumulate meaning, because every generation must choose what to remember and why. Franklin remains on the $100 bill because he earned it through a lifetime of extraordinary achievement, because he represents values that Americans claim to honor, because his face is recognizable and meaningful, because practical considerations of currency design favor his continued presence, and because each generation has found sufficient reason to keep him there. These reasons intertwine and reinforce each other, creating a consensus that has endured across nearly a century of currency redesigns and social changes. Whether this consensus will continue indefinitely remains to be seen. Currency designs do evolve, and there are compelling arguments for including new faces that represent the full diversity of American achievement. But for now, Franklin endures, his slight smile suggesting he understands something about the ironies of fame and remembrance, his presence on the nation's most valued bill serving as a daily reminder of revolutionary virtues and Enlightenment ideals, his story continuing to inspire new generations to believe that intelligence, effort, and civic virtue can still make a difference in the world. Rest now in peace, surrounded by the gentle darkness of night, cradled in the knowledge that we are all part of ongoing stories larger than ourselves, that the symbols we create and maintain connect us across time, and that questions about currency and memory open into deeper explorations of identity and values that help us understand who we are and who we might become. Thank you for joining me on this quiet journey through history, for allowing these stories to accompany you into the peaceful hours of night. May your sleep be deep and restorative, your dreams peaceful, and your waking tomorrow filled with the energy and curiosity that Franklin himself embodied. Until we meet again in this quiet corner of history, where past and present converse in whispers, I bid you the gentlest of good nights. Sleep well, dear friend, and know that these stories will be waiting whenever you return, ready to guide you once more into the fascinating complexities of our shared past.